Welcome everybody to our third digital presentation. These have gone really well. Very pleased that everyone's able to get in and join us and find out what we're up to. It's really good. This afternoon, Gita Ramdharry is going to cover physical activity and HSP and rehabilitation and all that sort of stuff. So Gita, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. So yes, I'm Gita Ramdharry, and I'm a consultant allied health professional and a physiotherapist by background, and I'm a clinical academic. So I work in clinical practice at Queen Square in London, but I'm also a researcher. And I've got a long history of research, particularly in genetic conditions and rare diseases. So Adam's been working on a project with us, which you'll hear about later on in the presentation. But as I've been working with people with HSP for many years, in fact, I spoke at sort of your AGMs many years ago. I don't know if you remember, I think it would have been about 2004, 2005, but some of you may remember me then. But what I wanted to talk about today, there's a few things to have a chat about. And what I wanted to do is not just talk about the physical activity side, but just maybe have a refresh on physical activity and physiotherapy as well, and really look at some of the research that others have done and I've done with colleagues to just explain and explore why certain approaches that you might work on with your physiotherapist, why we set what we do. And then we'll talk a bit more about more general activities, not just the sort of prescribed physiotherapy, as it were, but also be more physically active in our everyday lives. And then have a sort of think about is what is there to help us keep physically active, and that's where we'll talk a little bit about the project that we're working on, that Adam's working with us very helpfully. So, and that's called the PARC project, and you'll hear about that near the end. So when you look at so I'm a researcher, I like looking at the papers and the science papers, and I'm a little bit obsessed with looking at walking patterns, and that was all my PhD work. And some of you may have heard of Professor John Marston, who's down in Plymouth. He was my PhD supervisor, and we looked at walking patterns in some inherited conditions. And actually, as physiotherapists, walking is a key area that we look at. We're very interested in how the lower limb moves. We look at the upper limb and the trunk as well, but we're very interested in that. And so here, this was our old lab that John and I had at Queen Square before he moved to the southwest. And so you can see here, I think this is one of his pals we managed to get into the lab. And so you can see that there are these sort of funny wands and markers here. And these are little infrared emitting diodes. So these little markers here and on these wands here emit infrared, and this camera up here, this tracker, I don't know if you can see my pointer moving around, but that tracks them, and it means then that we can follow somebody a little bit like a stick figure actually, and look at what's happening around the hip, around the knee, and around the ankle, and it comes up with some quite pretty pictures. They look a bit sort of complex, and they are actually, and it's sort of after years of looking at them that you look, but it means that we can look at the angles that the pelvis moves through, the hips move through, the knee and the ankle and the forefoot. So actually, when we compare perhaps the people without HSP, or look at, and in this study, this is a study where they looked at different patterns of walking for people with HSP, if people had a neuropathy as well, or just a pure HSP. So these are the sort of diagrams that can be quite interesting to people like myself. So, but then it's really, well, what do we do with that information? So this is actually a graph from this work I did with Professor Marsden. So this is what we did in that lab. And so this is the knee. This is how the knee bends. So that's where the knee's bending, that's where it's straightening, that's where it's bending quite a lot, and that's in one stride. So as you'll pick your foot up to swing your leg through, there's quite a lot of knee bend going on. And what we found was that people with HSP, which is this thin line, had a stiffer, the knee didn't bend quite as much. And I know I'm preaching to the converted, this is your life, and you know that that's what happens. But what we wanted to understand was what were the factors that led to that. So one of the factors that led to that is when there was stiffness in the thigh muscles, particularly the quadriceps muscle at the front. And I've put this term passive stiffness because when we look at muscle stiffness, we look at two elements. There's active stiffness, which is the spasticity and the spasms, you know, sometimes if your leg jumps up and down, that's what we call more active stiffness. So that's because of that's sort of a neurological pathway. And then we have the passive stiffness where the tissues just get stiff and a bit stuck down. And actually, in this study, it was quite complex how Professor Marsden did it, and I was helping him with the data collection. We looked at the activity of the muscle to see if the muscle was silent or active while we stretched it at different speeds. And we found that, yes, it was the stiffness of the knee was actually related to just the passive stiffness. So actually, what is the underlying length of those muscles? Now, the good news with that, for me as a physio, is that I have some physio tricks up my sleeve that can help passive stiffness. And some of you will have I'm sure, but been prescribed some of these. And one of them is stretching. So here, that's me actually stretching the front of my hip, which can get very tight. People with HSP. This lady here is stretching the quadricep muscle here. And some people might have worn night splints or have some sort of splinting to help keep the calf nice and strong, nice and flexible. So because the more active stiffness, that's where the drugs tend to come in, the baclofen and other drugs that you may take, because that's basically quietens down some of the neural overactivity. But when it comes to stuck down tissues, stretches and splinting basically gives a long stretch over time. That's what can be helpful. So that's why the people I see in my clinic with HSP, stretches is something I'm commonly prescribing, working through with someone, trying to find a good position where they can stretch most effectively. And here in this, it's worth thinking as well in this, we're just looking at stretching of the thigh here because I'm just illustrating it with the data. But of course, I'll look at stretching other areas where people tend to get tight, like the lower back and the inside of the legs as well, where they turn in. And then the other thing we found that linked to how little bend there was that it wasn't just the stiffness, it was also down to weakness. So weakness of the calf muscle, because the calf muscle is a very strong muscle over a small lever. Our foot is a small lever, and the calf muscle gives us our push forward, our oomph. It's what speeds us up when we're walking. It's what enables children to hop. It's a very strong muscle that can give strong bursts of activity. And when people get weakness of the calf muscle, what we see, and this is something I've studied in lots of conditions, is that walking can slow down. The stride, each step can become shorter. And what we found in this study is that actually the knee bend was less. So if you're not getting the push from the calf, then the knee will not bend as much. So again, there's a few things up my sleeve as a physio that I'd be thinking, right, weakness. And what we also found, not just looking at this is from the same study. So this is some of the different muscles in the leg. This is the calf. So PF is just the scientific name, which is plantar flexor, but it's basically the calf muscle. And these are the bars of people with HSP, and the black bars for people who didn't have HSP but were about the same age and gender, etc. So that's you can see that the calf muscle is quite a lot weaker. But if you look across, this is the quadriceps muscles, the top of the thighs. This is the hip, the gluteal muscles that extend the hip. These are the muscles at the front of the ankle, the hamstrings, and then the muscles that flex the hip and bend it forward. You can see that actually the group that we were looking at were weak on all accounts. So actually, I think it's something not just the calf that needs to be looked at, but across all of those muscles. And so as a physio, I would be prescribing strengthening exercises for that. So we love a bit of, in fact, I've got some here. I use this for when I'm doing my video clinics, a bit of TheraBand. And you can get this online, it's very cheap. And so this is an exercise that can be done in long sitting like this. Well, this is just as easily done on a chair. And you loop the band around the foot and you push it down a bit like you're pushing on an accelerator pedal. And then this is for people who have weakness at the front of the foot, and particularly people with neuropathy and HSP can get weak here, pulling the foot up. This is a good catch-all. I love this one. It's a wall squat. So if you can, the nice thing with standing with your back to a wall is you don't have to worry about your balance, and you can slide up and down. Doesn't have to be very deep. But that's a really good one for strengthening the muscles at the tops of the legs, the thighs, the hips. And then some people quite like to use ankle weights. So this one is strengthening the hamstring here. You can sit down with ankle weights and just straighten the knee. So there's lots of different ways of strengthening. But I think in the past, when I first started seeing people with HSP, when I first went to Queen Square many years ago, it was everybody concentrated on the spasticity and the, particularly with the drugs and the stretches. But actually, I think what we've seen is weakness is just as much of an issue, and actually strengthening is really important. And of course, there's other ways now. There's more technologically advanced ways of dealing with certainly the strength and timing of muscle activity. And I'm not an expert in FES. Some of my colleagues at Queen Square are. We have a dedicated FES clinic. So this is functional electrical stimulation. So this is where the electrical impulse is applied over the muscles while people are walking. So they trigger and they help to either lift the foot or push from the calf. And we have a few people with HSP who are seen in our FES clinic, and some people get on very well with it. Some people find it a bit of a faff. It's quite a personal choice, and some of you may have tried and some of you may use it. So that's strengthening and stretching. What about more general fitness and activity? So certainly in physio, we think about 3 types of exercise. So it's strength, stretch, but also the aerobic, the sort of exercise that gets you out of puff and that is more to do with your more general fitness. And actually, when I looked to see what studies have been done on how the effects on that type of fitness in people with HSP, I couldn't find anything. There's not been very much work done. Having in some related conditions, and I'll come to that in a moment, where there's crossover with HSP, but not in HSP itself. But some of you may be aware of this paper. So this was a paper which is the health survey that was done in Norway of 108 adults with HSP, and they took data from a big sort of national survey as well. So they had, I think, about 46,000 people who didn't have a disease, and they compared the data to them. And so what we do know from that data, very little, because there wasn't much on exercise and physical activity, but we do know that they collected how frequently people were active, physically active, whether or not they were doing a bit of exercise or just sort of getting out and about for a walk. And these are the percentages of what they found from those 108. So there was a percentage of people who were really inactive, who didn't do very much at all. Unfortunately, they were the smallest percentage, which is good. And then less than once a week. Once a week, about 22%. Most people were doing about 2 to 3 times a week, which is good. And some people really keen exercises and did daily exercise. So it's actually pretty good. So I think, the messages that I and others and people have been giving about the importance of staying active is really, really good. But sometimes we find there are challenges to our ability to do that. And I was involved a few years ago with a consultation exercise with Public Health England, where they did this Everybody Active Every Day. They spoke to stakeholders, they spoke to people from different charity groups, people from disability sport, and it was all around people with disability staying active. And I have to say, they presented some of the data beforehand, and I was actually really quite shocked because I didn't quite realise how serious, this is before I was doing the physical activity research myself, and it kind of spurred me on really, but how sort of serious lack of physical activity is, because it's that what they said is that it can be responsible for 1 in 6 deaths in the UK, and it actually makes it as dangerous as smoking to our health. The longer we sit, the more we increase our risk of diseases such as heart disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, etc. And then what they found more generally, looking across the, people with disabilities, not just physical disabilities, this is people who might have deafness, blindness, etc., but they were half as likely to be active as people without a disability. So this sort of spurred me on to look at this in more detail anyway. And actually, I looked at this in a condition that's not unrelated to HSP. It's an inherited neuropathy. The sort of the name you might have heard is Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, and actually with some genes for that cross over between HSP and Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, and certainly I know some people have with HSP also have a neuropathy, and this is a I would say this is a related condition. But what we did in this study is that we looked at 20 people with inherited neuropathy, and we matched it to people who didn't have a neuropathy. And we got them to wear the activity monitors. Those were the days before you had the nice little neat Fitbits, you know, this sort of big thing on your arm. But what was quite interesting with this is that when we looked at, you know, one measure of activity, it might be the number of steps per day that people might take. You know, the government tells us that to be healthy, we should take about 10,000 steps per day. And our control people who didn't have the neuropathy did about 11,500. They were pretty active, whereas the people with the neuropathy did about 6,500. So certainly people were doing less steps, but if you have problems with your walking, then you can kind of understand why. But there were a few other things that we found, and one of them was actually really interesting, is that when we looked at the body mass index, so that's how sort of large people are, so it's your weight divided by your height squared. We found that the people who were larger, who tended to be in the sort of overweight and obese category, were the people who spent most time not doing anything, so the most time sedentary. So it's not just about going to the gym and sweating it out, it's also about not sitting for long periods. And with all of us now having to do, like I've been doing video clinics, and you know, we're all sort of at our desks at the moment looking at screens, and so I'm really, that's why I have my TheraBand here, so I can be doing something while I'm in between meetings, because sitting for long periods and being sedentary long periods is not good for us. And certainly in that health survey, the Norwegian one, they did find that people with HSP spent more hours sitting compared to control. So although they did do things during the week, as we saw with the physical activities graph I showed you earlier, people also did tend to sit for longer. And actually, interesting, when we did this study, we found the same trend with the people who didn't have the inherited neuropathy. So the controls, the bigger people in the control group were the ones who sat for longest. So what could be the impact of this? So this is a sort of quite a general diagram, really. But what we worry about, and why we're coming up with ways of trying to increase activity and exercise, is that we worry about the muscles getting weaker. And what we just saw on the graphs earlier, when we were looking at weakness in HSP, it might not be the HSP itself that's making those muscles weak. It might be that people have become deconditioned, and that might be why the muscles are weak. It's difficult to know completely, unless you have a neuropathy, and then there's a little bit more associated weakness with that. But it may well be that those muscles are weak through non-use, and the good news there is that that's reversible. We can get that back with training. People then have reduced fitness levels, and certainly in the inherited neuropathy group, we've done studies looking at exercise testing, sort of when you put the mask on and you get people to work on an exercise bike and look at their maximum fitness levels, and we found that is reduced to about 80% in people with inherited neuropathy. It's not been done in HSP, but I suspect there probably would be some similarity. People found that it impacted their quality of life and their mood. People sort of told us that they were underactive, and also fatigue levels can be higher as well. There's some relationships between fatigue and physical activity that we've seen again in related conditions. But what's been really interesting, and Adam flagged this study up for me a few weeks ago, which was brilliant, particularly because we were about to put our grant in for the PARC study, is of course we've had some enforced lack of physical activity recently with the lockdown. And this is a great study that came from Netherlands, beautifully timed for us. But actually, what they did was they asked people through a survey with HSP to compare their activity levels before and after, during lockdown. I think it was 5 weeks into, they had a partial lockdown in the Netherlands. And what they found was, what they looked at was what was the impact of that on people's symptoms. And so there were some other graphs on there, but I just wanted to highlight this one, is that where people were still keeping about the same levels of activity, there wasn't really that much of a change in their symptoms. So stiffness, pain, fatigue, balance and gait, as in walking problems. But the people who said, yeah, they were now less active, found that their symptoms had got worse in all of them, actually, particularly if you look at stiffness there, in particular fatigue and walking difficulty. So it is it's not our fault at the moment, in a way, in that we're having to, what is already challenging to achieve in our day-to-day lives is even more challenging when with lockdown, particularly if we head off into another type of lockdown over the next few weeks in different areas. But it's I think what's very helpful for me as a researcher to see here that actually there's a good reason why we need to try and help people stay physically active, because it has an impact on people's condition and then in turn their daily lives. So that brings me on to PARC. So we've in fact, I first met Adam was with our very first meeting of PARC, and Ian came as well. That was January 2018 in Cardiff. And so there was myself, I was doing a lot of work in inherited neuropathies and muscular dystrophies. There was another colleague, a professor in Cardiff, who's doing a lot of work in Huntington's disease. John, who has done a lot of work in HSP, so he came, John Marsden, and others who had experience in physical activity and exercise research in other rare neurological conditions. Because I think what we realised was that people with rare neurological conditions tend to miss out on the research, and they tend to miss out on the services, because a lot of the neurological services are geared towards people who've had strokes, MS and Parkinson's, the most common conditions. And also, and again, I'm sure I'm teaching my grandmother in a way, but also what people were telling us was that finding health professionals with expertise in their rare condition was difficult. And there's not many people around who know much about HSP or any of the other conditions that we're looking at. And we were thinking, well, we know that physical activity is important for lots of conditions. And some of those more generic challenges are the same in terms of getting people with expertise and access, etc. So actually, is there an opportunity for us to get some strength in numbers and look across lots of rare conditions? So we teamed together with 7 charities, and Adam and Ian came on behalf of the HSP charity. And also we had, at that first meeting, we had quite a few people living with different rare conditions, somebody with muscular dystrophy, somebody with another condition called PSP, another lady with ataxia. And then, as I said, there was a group of us who are academics who have interest in this area. So there's a few of us there, and since then we've grown as a group as well, as we've realised we needed statistics people and we needed psychology people. So we've kind of gathered like a rolling stone gathering moss in a way. We've brought people along with us. So just before we launch into looking at the physical activity side, you hear physical activity and exercise used interchangeably. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone's clear on the definitions of what I mean by each. So physical activity is the all-encompassing definition. So it's any activity, and it could be occupation. So gardeners might be more active perhaps than office workers. It could be a sport, whether it's golf or swimming or anything like that. It could be something more like doing your housework or gardening. And then within that, exercise, that's a subset of physical activity. So it comes under the physical activity umbrella, but it's a bit more structured and planned. So normally it's repetitive. So this guy here is doing his leg presses, and this person here is doing their exercise bike. And actually the goal of exercise is to improve some aspects of physical fitness, whether that's strength, muscle length, or more the aerobic fitness that I was talking about earlier. So exercise is part of physical activity, but physical activity is much broader. And certainly the society I belong to, the Charter Society of Physiotherapy, they've been running a campaign called Hate Exercise, Love Activity, because they realised that exercise in the gym and getting sweaty isn't everybody's bag. But what we really want to promote as a profession is even just making sure you're not sitting for long periods, that extra dog walk, or just like I do, sort of try and move around a little bit more in the day, are ways of just increasing your movement. So it's any sort of movement really. And so at this first meeting in Cardiff, we wanted to hear from people what they thought would be important about a physical activity program or a physical activity intervention. What would help them? And we thought that was very important. It wasn't just us as physio nerds, you know, putting down what we thought was important. We wanted to hear from people who live with these conditions. And so what was very helpful for us to understand, and this was all what came for the people who were there, is that there were impacts on people's, when I say impairments, that's how the condition presents. So how we might think about how the condition changes over time, keeping as much function and as much ability for as long as possible, staying well. And I mentioned mood earlier, and improving mood, and other positive effects as well on sleep. And then how we might promote physical activity when there's a change in the disease itself. And then more broadly, what was really helpful to hear is that actually people felt that the social engagement was really important. Doing something normal, going to the gym is what everyone else does. So actually I'd quite like to do that as well. Actually, personally, I hate gyms, but this is what everyone else was saying. And actually what might be the benefits to family and to carers if that person is more physically active. But then there were some, you know, people taking control, making choices. And I certainly heard that in some of the exercise trials that I ran when we interviewed people after. People said, you know, just doing something positive about my condition for me was a real bonus of taking part in this study. But we recognised, you know, that actually community facilities are not always easy to access. There's stairs, there's, you know, there's different levels in gyms or whatever. And also some people feel that gyms are, you know, have an aesthetic, you know, people, young fit people working out, and actually they don't always feel part of that. Not everybody, but that certainly came through. But what was really helpful for us to understand as an academic team was actually we were struck, and I think everybody was actually, at the similarities of the challenges that were coming from people with all of these different conditions, and that yes, these conditions were different. The label was different, whether it's muscular dystrophy or if it was HSP or if it was ataxia. But so there were some really common problems like fatigue, like thinking about your mood, and dealing with falls risks. Everybody had issues with balance. Everybody varied from day to day, and there were certainly issues around in lifespan. So for people who have the conditions in childhood, transitioning to adulthood, and then transitioning retirement, for example, and knowing when to push on and when to stop. This was a common thing that came up from all the people we were hearing from. So that we then applied for some funding to do some development work to find out a little bit more about the area. So we got funding for a year, and Adam and others came along that journey with us. And the aim of PARC was to basically look at how we can facilitate engagement in physical activity. And with that aim of really improving health and well-being outcomes across the life cycle of somebody's condition. And what we wanted to do at the end of it is have a better idea of what might work. What we were thinking at the time, at the beginning of this journey, was that we might be able to come up with some symptom-based, a personalised physical activity intervention approach that people can engage with. But we needed to do the groundwork for that year. So we asked a number of questions. So one of the first questions we asked were, what are the barriers people experience? What is it that's difficult at the moment about accessing or being able to engage in physical activity? So our brilliant researcher Valentina at the time, she did some interviews with people from the different charities, because we thought that the people representing the charities have an idea of what their members talk about, what the challenges their members come across. So we started off with some interviews. And these were the things that came up. So the one theme that came up was about how healthcare is organised in community facilities, and that there were problems with access to specialist services, community services, problems accessing exercise facilities, public transport to some of these facilities. And then thinking about the health side of things, that specialist health services and community services didn't really communicate very well. As I mentioned before, healthcare professionals didn't really have good knowledge. There was limited activities for exercise for people with mobility issues. So that was the first sort of big theme that came up from the interviews. The next thing that came up was actually if people were working with somebody, whether it was a healthcare professional, a fitness professional, or members of their family, what were the issues there? So again, it came back to knowledge of what are the benefits of physical activity and what are the risks, what are the confidence in being able to do things. Professionals being over worried about risk of falls, for example, making time. Does this present an additional burden to carers and family members? And then also very much the culture of the family. If you have a family who enjoy activity and everybody participates, that's probably it may come easier than a family who maybe aren't so physically active. And then down to the individual themselves, you know, people might have fallen when they were doing something, so understandably will be quite fearful of perhaps moving too much in an environment they're not used to. Perhaps knowing what the risks and the benefits are, knowing what to do, when and how, really important. So particularly if you've not had guidance from a healthcare professional, how do I know what I'm doing is going to help and is safe? And then staying motivated. I mean, we all struggle with motivation, particularly when it's hot like this. But actually, what are the psychological motivations, the physical motivations that can engage us with exercise? And then the next thing we did, sorry about the sort of big busy table, but I'll just summarize it, is that we did a survey of people living with rare neurological conditions, and quite a few people with HSP participated in this. And we also surveyed 94 family members. And what was really nice, actually, what was really good to see, if we see up here, you know, people have felt that they had the knowledge and the opportunity to be physically active. 68% was quite high percentages. But where we start to see those percentages slipping off is that basically people had to agree with these statements. So it was to do with accessing facilities, knowing where to seek support, getting that support quickly. People weren't really finding that. They didn't feel well supported by the community and they needed encouragement. And there were sort of similar patterns with what was coming from the family and carers. The other thing we did was we looked at all of the studies that have been done looking at physical activity and exercise interventions across the rare conditions. And so we did what's called a scoping review. So we looked at all of the reviews of these types of interventions and treatments. And this was, in a way, a wholly disappointing exercise in that we found, I think it was, I've not put the number on, I think it was like about 40. In the end, we only had about 20 studies to look at. And very few studies, good quality studies have been done looking at physical activity and exercise. Most of them are in structured exercise, very few on more general physical activity. And what we found is that most of them were done in people with neuromuscular conditions, so that's muscular dystrophies and inherited neuropathies. Some of people with motor neurone disease, ataxia. There was not one review or one study, and I've still not been able to find one. I think there was one on hydrotherapy in HSP, but other than that, there's very little been done in exercise in HSP, and I think we need to address that. We need to do something about that. So what we wanted to see was, well, what's worked, because then we can learn from what's worked, but we didn't really find anything that was going to help us with that. So it was a disappointing exercise. So that led us to think, well, we probably need to come up with something then, and we need to test it out ourselves and measure how successful our own physical activity intervention is. So in order to measure something, what we found in that review is that the scientists like to measure sciencey stuff. So they'll measure, you know, how many kilograms a muscle can lift, or what percentage of oxygen somebody takes in and out when they're doing an exercise test. It's all very, you know, the scientists love all that, very precise. But what it doesn't do is give you much indication of how it's affecting that person in their everyday life. So we decided, right, we were going to go the other way. We wanted to hear from people living with rare conditions, rare neurological conditions, what's important to them. So we had a workshop. This wasn't us, they're far too good looking, but we had lots of post-it notes and much more cake, if I remember rightly. And we had a really good workshop in Cardiff again. And what we asked the people from the charities and people living with the conditions, what are the important areas for you? And we managed to break it down into 3 main areas. One of them was physical well-being, one of them was psychological well-being, and one of them was being able to participate in the day-to-day activities that are important for you as a person. And we were able to then break that down a little bit more. So the bits about physical well-being was being able to still do those functions and those tasks that you need to be independent. So walking, climbing stairs, getting in and out of the car, etc. The psychological well-being, emotional well-being and mood, enjoyment, motivation came up again, confidence to be able to do something. That's the knowing what to do, how and when. And being able to participate in activities such as leisure, work, school, being able to be spiritual. And what we did, the ticks and crosses here is where we found there's a measure. So we have these sort of different measures where, a little bit like what I showed you with the survey, where you get people to rate things. So one of them is called the OXPAC, which I know Adam's been looking at recently as well, for the use in the survey. So the OXPAC it was developed by colleagues in Oxford, and it asks questions in all those areas, hence the green ticks. So we were happy with that. And then where we didn't find that it had that, we found another questionnaire to do with confidence and self-efficacy, where these three are taken care of. So those are going to be two of our measures that we'll use when we come to, if we get a chance to develop an intervention. So what we're then moving on to, so now we've got a better understanding now of what people want, what the struggles are, and actually we need to design something that helps to people to overcome that, and what we should measure. So actually we've now been thinking about, well, what do we want our PARC treatment, our PARC intervention to look like? So we're going to take advantage of the technology that's around us that we're using so nicely today, and develop some online resources and some planning tools. So this is a website that I've worked with some colleagues called Bridges. This is for people with neuromuscular conditions, people with muscular dystrophy. And we launched this in January. So this is a website where you can go to. It's got people's stories. So stories about them, stories about how they've met certain challenges, like being able to stay in work, how to work when you have fatigue, negotiating relationships. Exercise and physical activity comes into this. Is quite a generic one. This isn't just physical activity focused, but we're probably going to work with Bridges again to do something that's more focused across rare conditions, because what we found when we did this, and this was all developed, all of the information on here was developed by people living with these conditions. So this is their advice, their information, and then there's also we've got the professional advice. So there's the Q&A from people like me and the orthotists and OTs and everyone. So that's one part of it, and we'll come up with these resources and some goal setting tools and some planning tools and how to monitor what you're planning and doing. Then the other part of PARC is that we will get some health professionals, particularly physios and OTs, and all. And these are my colleagues Charlotte and Kate, who are physios, and this is Becca, who's an OT, and they're on the Bridges website. And so we'll train them in how to prescribe physical activity, exercise if people want exercise, how to help people to set those goals, coach people along, and then what we anticipate is that they'll be done. Basically, the coaches will use these resources in some one-to-one sessions. Remote, there might be some face-to-face, and we have to see what happens with COVID, of course, but the fallback there would be remote sessions over Zoom like this, where people can then start to have a think about what they enjoy. So this isn't about me handing you a sheet of exercises. Okay, we've done that, you know, and that can work for a bit, but this is about people making lifestyle changes. So actually, the sort of thing that the coaches might do is, so if somebody wants to become more physically active, well, what do you enjoy? You know, what have you enjoyed in the past? What's the challenge to that now? How can we adapt to that? Or is there a way that we can, you know, use some other equipment that means you can still engage in that? Or is there somewhere locally where they might do disability golf or something that actually might find a lot more fun than going on an exercise bike? So it's looking at it in a slightly different way. And so that's kind of what we're thinking it's going to look like. So what we've done, so the next, and this all happened in a flurry of activity, is that we've put a big application to a funding body called the NIHR, and Adam's one of our co-applicants on that, and will lead our what we call the patient public involvement committee for that, because we know this has to be done in partnership with it. We don't know what's needed. You guys know what's needed, which is why we've always worked with people to tell us. This is why the partnership is very important. So that we put in the grant for the first stage, and fingers crossed, we're crossing everything. It's quite a lot of money we're asking for, but we think it would be good, so that will help us to develop the intervention with all the technology, etc., and then test it out in a big trial. And that's the really expensive bit, the trial. Research is expensive and takes a long time, sadly. But fingers crossed we get that, and if we are successful, you'll hear about it, because we'll be wanting volunteers to come and participate in the trial. So that's me really. That's just a run through the physiotherapy side, a bit on physical activity, and then I think how we're trying to make it a bit easier for people. So if you've got any questions, and thank you for listening.